afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining the Extended Day Ahead Market Working Group 1 meeting related to the supply commitment and resource efficiency evaluation topics. I'm Christina Osborne, representing ISO's Stakeholder Affairs Group. I'll be providing support for the meeting. And I'm jumping straight to the agenda. Mark Richardson is out on vacation, so Phil Pettengill is filling in for him as facilitator this week, and Phil's normal role is the coordinator of all three of the EDAM working groups. So Phil is going to start by continuing the discussion on the RSC failure consequences, and then Danny Johnson will share ISO's thoughts on a financial approach. And then at the end, Bob Cott, who is the scribe for this working group, will summarize the discussion, and then we'll review the topics for the next meeting, which, by the way, was rescheduled from this past Monday to Friday since it fell on President's holiday. So details for that meeting can be found on ISO's public calendar. And then these meetings are intended to be collaborative. We do encourage you to ask questions and share perspectives on the various topics. So please feel free to raise your hand if at any time you have a question, and Phil will call on you. And once your line has been unmuted, please start by stating your name and affiliation. We are recording the meeting today. We'll post a video file out on the corresponding working group webpage, where you'll find the presentation and other materials related to these meetings. And the recordings and any other related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And also, let us know if you're interested in presenting at an upcoming working group meeting using the inquiry link located on the resources slide at the end of this presentation, and we'll reach out to you to coordinate the logistics for that meeting. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the meeting over to Phil Pettengill. And Phil, don't forget to unmute yourself.
Yep. There we go. All right. Can you hear me okay now?
Yes. Thank you.
All right. Good. Well, hey, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the discussion today. As Christina mentioned, our usual facilitator, Mr. Mark Richardson, is taking the week off as he has a vacation with his family, so good luck to him. I hope he's enjoying it. And, you know, as the work group coordinator, that means I get to fill in. So I hope I can only do half as well as he's been doing, and certainly working with all of you over these last multiple weeks. We're down to literally about 5 weeks left, I think, in our session. So looking forward to this conversation today. And as Christina mentioned, if you've seen the schedule for this week, we do have that makeup session on Friday. I'll just mention that what we're going to talk about on Friday is a briefing on the fundamentals of RUC as well as convergence bidding. So look forward to having you join us on that session. It will be in the morning from 9 to 11, so we'll get that out of the way for our Friday morning session. But it'll give all of us an opportunity just to better understand how those things work. We've had a number of questions in this session about that, so we're looking forward to trying to share that information with all of you. If you got a chance to look at the presentation slides today, just a little sort of forevisioning here on what's going on. I'm going to continue the discussion around the RSC failure consequences. As you remember, you know, in our last meeting, I really felt like we had a really good discussion that almost ruled out the idea of limiting transfers physically as a consequence. But that discussion really started to turn to ideas of financial penalties as incentives and how that we can all make sure that we're bringing enough resources to the EDAM in that day ahead time frame. So with those opening remarks, let me go ahead and sort of jump to my opening slide here. We talk about what those objectives are. And like I mentioned, you know, we had the RSC failure consequences was a topic that Mark teed up and we talked about a little bit in our last session last week. And the idea is, you know, to the extent any one of the entities fails the RSC, what actions should we take? And so Mark had these 2 bullets, but I wanted to update us because the first one was limiting that participation in transfers. But as I put here in red, I'm trying to capture the notion that at least most parties wanted to explore this financial approach. So today what we've done is set up the conversation. So we have Danny Johnson from the ISO going to talk to us about some thoughts about how a financial type approach might work. So we touched on these issues of should it be hourly, should it be daily? I thought there were some good ideas about can we focus on particular seasons or hours that are more high risk? And then, of course, the idea is how do we determine what is the value of that financial penalty? I think we also ought to be thinking about, is it, you know, a single event, multiple events? Does it progressively get more intense Those kinds of things are other themes that, as I thought about our conversation today, that we might get into. So with that, let me stop there and just see, Christina, do we have any comments in terms of just getting us started, or should we go ahead and hand it off to Danny and sort of get our day going today?
Anybody in the queue, but just as a reminder that it's just the hand icon above the chat window, or if you just dialed in, press #2, and it looks like we do have Ryan in the queue. And just, Ryan, if you could introduce yourself first, please. So Adam, go ahead.
Ryan? Ryan, we can't hear you. There we go.
How about now?
We got you now.
Awesome, thanks. I just wanted to clarify when we're talking about the financial approach. Last time I thought where we kind of ended up was this idea of a full optionality, where if you have an advisory test and you see that you're failing and you anticipate that you won't be able to pass, you could take the option to exit the market, or you can take the option to have the penalty applied. So it seemed like a blend of the two. Is that what we're discussing in the financial approach, or is that not reflected at all in what we're going to be discussing?
Well, I don't think so, Ryan, because I think the idea of exiting the market would suggest that on a daily basis you could participate in EDAM or not. And if you go back and remember some of the conversation we had early on in this group, one of the principles was, while we said it was voluntary over a longer period of time, right? Many months, should we say. So I don't think the option of being able to exit just because you couldn't pass is something that we had contemplated. So no, I don't think I heard that being put on the table. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think maybe I'm getting confused because we mixed topics around. I thought we were talking about some optionality there that now you're saying doesn't exist. So let me think about that a minute, and I'll circle back as the conversation goes forward.
All right, fair enough. I see Eric Johnson's entered the queue. Adam, can we open up Eric?
Hi, this is Eric Johnson with the City of Pasadena. At the end of the last meeting, Alvis Svoboda he brought up an interesting concept of using something that was akin to the CPM mechanism that we currently have in the ISO, where that would be where the ISO would procure the power for them and then they would be charged for it. To me, that seems like that might be an option. Is that one of the things we'll be discussing today? Because what I'm thinking is that if they're left leaning on the market, then everyone will end up with a higher market clearing price. Yeah,
so, Eric, I think we did capture that idea. I'm going to let Danny tell us whether the ISO team has thought about that concept or not. But certainly it's something I think we ought to explore as a group here. Is there any value, beyond California? I mean, in my view, I guess I think about that as something that could be a way in which the California entities, underneath the California ISO, seek to sort of cure what looks like a deficiency, right? If we're going to have these multiple forward runs, can we clear that and be ready to go by the 9 or 10 o'clock a.m. timeframe that we're talking about? So it may only be something that's done in the ISO, but what about something that could potentially provide value to other EDAM entities as well? So I think we ought to discuss it, and I think Danny's going to touch on that. So let's see if he is, but let's put it in the parking lot and make sure we come back to that.
Okay, I'll wait. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Good one.
Thanks, Phil. I do think that we plan to touch on that. We have a slide that's very general, and we're looking for ideas on how this could be implemented.
Okay.
I did have one follow-up for you, Eric. When you said that a leaning BA would cause higher prices, can you expound on that? I guess our thought would be there's existing capacity in the footprint, and kind of the backstop mechanism would be procuring that capacity so an entity could pass the RSC, but that capacity would be there bid in anyway. Like, are you thinking of capacity that's not offered into the EDAM that the backstop authority would be procuring that would then be offered into the EDAM?
What I'm thinking is, how is the market price derived for any given hour? So the way that it's derived is the last bit of generation determines the price. So if we have to get a higher priced power because they didn't bring something potentially, I mean, it could go either way, but the idea is that the more power that we have going into the EDAM, the lower the prices will be, because it'll give you the lowest cost solution. Now, if we have to go high,
so I
the
guess
next
the concern
solution.
would be just.
Go ahead.
I was going to say the concern is that the entire footprint would just clear incrementally higher up on the bid stack because we're
Correct.
clearing more demand for that BAA that would be deficient. Okay.
Correct.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for clarifying.
Thank you.
All right. Good. Thanks, Eric. Appreciate that. Okay. Well, Danny, it looks like you're already into it. So let's move, I guess, to the next slide and let Danny start his conversation around financial consequences. Danny, take it away.
Thanks, Phil. So there's two different time frames I think this can occur. We have a couple slides on what could be done through the actual market clearing process to cure a resource insufficiency. And then after that, we have a couple slides which I think go a little bit more to what Eric was talking about, was what are the mechanisms that the EDAM can offer to allow entities to cure a resource insufficiency prior to the final binding run so they are sufficient when we actually go into running the market. So I think starting with the solutions that could be part of the market clearing process, our first thought was some type of hurdle rate. The idea here is during hours when an entity would fail, a hurdle rate would be placed on their transmission that would ensure that depending on where the hurdle rate is, the supply would be utilized internal to the BAA before then allowing additional transfers into that BAA. It would ensure that entities who supported the incremental transfers would be compensated, at least the neighbors. I think the struggle here is depending upon the price that you put the hurdle rate at, there could be deviation from the prevailing bilateral prices. I think in very stressed system conditions, it would make sense to have a hurdle rate near the bid cap, and then that's ensuring that all of the supply internal to an EDAM BAA is getting utilized, and then pricing that excess supply near the bid cap, which may reflect a little bit closer to where the bilateral markets are during tight system conditions. But to the extent that this type of approach was used for just curing resource insufficiencies during like non-emergency conditions, and I guess what I imagine here is an entity could be resource insufficient in April when the entire footprint is flush with capacity, but for some reason, a lot of the resources within the forward contracted resources within their control area are on spring maintenance outages at the same time to prepare for summer. So to the extent you have a very large hurdle rate at that time, it could offer kind of odd incentives and maybe make the EDAM not the best place to cure that insufficiency. The other thought, I think that goes back to what Ryan was saying a little bit, is not is participation in EDAM optional, but would be utilizing a market mechanism to cure a hurdle rate or to cure a resource insufficiency through a hurdle rate. Would that be an optionality that the EDAM would offer? The final question is how would the revenue be allocated? Using a hurdle rate, it would mainly go to the neighboring BAAs. The entire footprint, I think, you could argue that it is supporting and helping to cure the resource insufficiency of the deficient BAA. So that's another question I'd like to open up and hear stakeholder feedback on. So first, is a hurdle rate a feasible approach? Would it be applied to all of the different buckets of transfers, only buckets 2 and 3, bucket 1? What would be the appropriate size of the hurdle rate? And then should this be optional? And finally, what's the preferred method for revenue allocation distribution?
Danny, let me start off here. I think I feel like I need to ask a clarifying question. I'm not quite following the first bullet in the sense that we want to ensure that supply within the deficient BAA is utilized. How can that be if they provided the RSC inputs and the RSC has failed? Isn't that suggesting that there is not enough supply for a deficient BA? So somehow or another there's supply that otherwise wasn't reflected in the RSE? Is that what you're saying here?
No, I think the supply would not be there and the RSE would have been failed. The question is would transfers to a deficient BAA economically displace highly priced supply available to that BAA? Is that an appropriate outcome of this setup?
Mm-hmm. And then you talk about how the revenue is being allocated. I presume that the deficient BAA is picking up the full cost, right? That we would somehow or another determine what is that elevated cost, and the deficient BAA would be funding all of that revenue stream. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think using a hurdle rate would embed the cost in the LMP of the BAA.
Okay. Yep. Fair enough. Looks like we've got Alva. Adam, can we unmute Alva? Thank you. Alva?
Just a general point here. So there's an assumption that the CAISO as the EDAM operator is able to determine that there is a feasible EDAM solution for these kinds of concepts to work. So one question is going to be, how does CAISO make that evaluation based on either the RSE or perhaps, as has been advocated by some people at my company, through some advisory information they have? Because this concept of a hurdle rate is not going to be a good one if there's actually, due to a resource deficiency in one area, there's a resource deficiency overall in the EDAM. And that's kind of the two sides of that situation are important to think about in terms of this issue, I think, just as on reliability grounds, aside from the concept of economic leaning.
Hey, Alva, two things. Can you just let everybody know who you're representing again?
Sorry. Yeah, I'm PG&E.
Great, thanks. So is it fair, Alva, if I'm hearing you right, is as I was asking Danny in his first bullet, concept here was there may be a EDAM BAA that's deficient, but it sounds like his first bullet was making the presumption that there was not a deficiency in the overall footprint. And you're just highlighting the fact that shouldn't we also consider what happens is there a deficiency in the whole footprint? Is that what I'm understanding your point?
Exactly. That CAISO in this model would need to have done some calculation that would allow it to say this is an acceptable solution. I think this is a good solution as long as CAISO is confident that it can restrict the effects of this to economics rather than reliability. But if there's any chance that it's not, then we have to be concerned about it.
Yeah. So maybe a simple way of saying this, what happens if there's an overall deficiency rather than a one or two BA deficiency?
Right. And that meaning just that the EDAM market will not be feasible as a whole.
Yeah.
For whatever reason.
Fair enough. Okay. All right.
Thanks.
Looks like we've got Jeffrey. Thank you, Alva. We've got Jeffrey Nelson in the queue. Operator.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Very good.
Nelson, SCE. Hey, so I'm a little confused on what's happening when. And it really, this is honest. I just am trying to understand the proposal framed question. So we're running the day-ahead RSE, right? That's what we have in mind here, day-ahead RSE for EDAM. Mm-hmm. And there's all these pre-checks that I'm not quite sure, whatever. We do some pre-check, but this is the real deal. So the ISO is running the real final RSE test. And it's never been quite clear to me if the real final RSE test is part of the actual market run or a process that happens beforehand. But anyways, maybe someone can clarify that. But we've run the real deal and we find out someone is failing the RSE test. So is the proposal here to put in a day-ahead hurdle rate where they would not be allowed to buy power out of the day-ahead market unless it exceeded the hurdle rate? Or is this a hurdle rate that's going to pass its way all the way through real time and they won't be able to buy power at any time from the ISO's market unless they're willing to pay above the hurdle rate for the hour they failed in the day-ahead market. So is this a purely day-ahead concept, or is this a concept that gets passed into real time and sort of, sticks with you like a tattoo?
Yeah. Good questions, Jeff. Danny, are you able to answer that, or maybe do we have George on the line? So what you're thinking here on this day ahead? Let's take day ahead first, Danny, and then move to real time as Jeff did.
Yeah, well, even backtracking from there, I would view the RSC as a pre-process that we're running immediately prior to trying to clear the day-ahead market. So I think the final bids and everything would close, and we'd run this and then use the results of this to inform maybe transfer limitations, or in this example, a hurdle rate that would be embedded on some hours in that day-ahead market run. I think it's depending on where the hurdle rate is, it is possible for a deficient BAA to not clear its full schedule in the EDAM, and then I guess they would come into the real-time imbalance, and the real-time EIM would then expect them to have hopefully cured that deficiency bilaterally between when we ran the day-ahead market and when we're running the EDAM market. So that is an option. I haven't thought through if that same hurdle rate would get embedded in the EIM's dispatch as well. Is that kind of what you were thinking, Jeff?
Yeah, I because my initial thought was if you've got some high hurdle rate in there, that their demand bids are going to kick in most likely in that balancing authority, and they'll buy, and then they'll just curtail their own day-ahead purchases and never even hit the hurdle rate. And then there's still, when they come into real time, we're still having the real-time RSC, right? The EIM is still going to run a real-time RSC. So then the EIM rules would kick in, and who knows, maybe their load never materialized and there's not a problem anymore, or maybe it was exactly right and they fail the EIM RSC now because they didn't take any other curative actions. And then we currently have rules in place that say, we've limited your transfer capability. I guess that's a sub question. Are we expecting rules that we make here to have any influence on the existing RSC EIM rules?
I think in the sense that an entity could be resource sufficient and have a day ahead schedule that they passed the RSC and they fully cleared, we would look to see what we could do moving into the real-time EIM RSC. Like at a minimum, the balancing test would be out. I think it's an open question on if the capacity test and the flexible RAM sufficiency test would still be applied as they're currently designed. I think there's an argument to do that since those tests for 15-minute variations, whereas the day-ahead schedules is looking at an hour. But I think the other thing you're thinking is to the point that entities are bidding in parts of their load, not all their load's going to clear, so they're going to go into the real-time deficient anyway, and I think that slightly presumes the approach that EIM entities take to participating in EDAM. I know the ISO load is bid in, but there is the potential for other entities to try to self-schedule most of their load, and I wouldn't want to presume how different BAAs participate in the EDAM.
Yeah.
So I interrupted you a little bit there.
Yeah, no, yeah. Well, I'd say it's certainly possible that they'd never hit the hurdle rate, right? They could sort of force it to get the supply if they really wanted to, but that's got weird potential market consequences, like Alva was talking about. One entity fails the test and the market blows up. We don't want to see that. But just a thought, in my mind, we've always had to preserve the EIM RSC kind of the way it is today, or the way it kind of is today, because I'm not expecting everyone that's an EIM member to become an EDAM member, at least on day one. So I'm expecting, people can stop me. I'm expecting the EIM to continue to grow a little bit and be really big, and EDAM, sort of like we did EIM, I'm expecting more to be waves where some people might start day one and more may come in. So it seems like we're always going to need the EIM test unless every single EIM member was also in EDAM, and then maybe we could talk about only needing one test. But until then, I don't see how to get rid of that.
that's a fair point. The one thought I had there was that the imbalances of product that the ISO is developing in parallel through the day-ahead market enhancements, that looks at the potential variance in net load between that day-ahead hour and any 15-minute interval in the following day. So to the extent that that's getting procured at a 97.5% confidence level, that may, I would expect that the majority of the schedules that are produced by the day-ahead market would easily pass the real-time EIM RSC, because it would have the additional bid range to meet any variations in net load. But your point is also taken that full onboarding with the entire footprint that's in EIM may not occur as we move forward with EDAM.
Okay, well,
guys.
thank you. I'll chew on all these.
Yeah, and thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate the way you characterize sort of where we are and, what changes might be necessary in EIM. I think the way I understand it is ISO is open to potentially changing the EIM, but, that would be kind of on a case-by-case basis. So until we sort of figure out what we're doing here with EDAM, it sort of makes sense, as you described, to say, let's assume that we don't change it until we find that we need to. But I think that's a fair characterization. Let me move to Stuart Kelly. Stuart, I see you in the queue. Operator, if we can unmute Stuart, and then Bobby Olson, I'm going to come to you next.
Hey, thanks, Phil.
Yeah.
My take on this is that whatever we come up with in terms of general principles for the RSC for EDAM, that they would form the foundations of what changes would be needed within EIM in the real time. And indeed, just based on a conversation that we had or a stakeholder meeting this morning, some of the concepts and principles, if they can be agreed upon, may even be applied sooner in real time than in EDAM. That's just an observation. So if we're going to allow incremental transfers and there's going to be a financial impact and we can come up with some principles, we may indeed see those changes sooner in EIM than maybe even EDAM. That is just a thought. I think there needs to be consistency and consideration for the other aspects of the EIM RSC. Yeah. That's just a thought. But obviously there needs to be consensus. The second piece is, can Danny just expand a little bit, Phil, on, identifying, or it says in the second bullet, ensure entities who supported the incremental transfers are compensated. What's the process, or give us a little bit more detail on how you're going to identify who supported that incremental transfer, under the optimization, what was the foundational element? And I take it that entity is kind of interchangeable with BA or region.
Yeah, Danny, you've got some thoughts on that?
Yeah. Thanks, Stuart. Okay, so the entity would be interchangeable with BAA. That's a little bit of a crosstalk in these slides. To your first point, I do think that we need to at least consider this in conjunction with the RSC failure, the EIM RSC failure consequences, which we did have a meeting on this morning. I think that was one of the original reasons we slated that process phase 2 for EIM RSC to begin this fall, was to try to figure out where we are in EDAM, realizing that does feed into the EIM RSC. I think the example that we talked about this morning of maybe using a bid capped penalty price or hurdle rate in the real-time RSC, we would want to consider how that would impact the EDAM, because to the extent that that's going to be in the real-time RSC, that could disincentivize for somebody trying to cure and be resource sufficient and have a full schedule in the EDAM process. I think on the allocation, if this is embedded in the LMP, it's embedded in the LMP, and then the entire footprint who may have served to cure that deficiency may not directly benefit in the same way that if this was an administrative charge that was charged to the deficient entity for every megawatt of failed transfer that they receive, then could be maybe pro rata spread out to the rest of the footprint. These are questions that we want feedback in. I don't think we have a proposal right now. We're just trying to look and see where stakeholders are on items.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense and ties into some other things that are happening vis-a-vis how we allocate transfers depending on what approach we take to allocation. So I appreciate that, Danny. Thank you.
Yeah, and let me just chime in here. I mean, Stuart, it's a good question. I'm glad Danny answered it the way he did, because remember, this is just literally days after our conversation we had last on this. So trying to get some concepts on the table, see if it works out, and then we can flesh it out. And then as Jeff was mentioning, it strikes me, then we need to figure out what are the implications, you know, for EIM, and it sounds like you've supported that as well, Stuart. So fair enough.
Yeah, I think we need to consider, I think based on conversations and comments from other parties this morning, there's a need to consider, you know, the upcoming summer and the potential for changes. We do need to have this conversation. It seems sensible that anything we're discussing in EDAM as we try and get through this, if there's general principles that are agreeable, that they may well be applicable to real time, and then we can look at, you know, what it would take to implement and if there's any of that can be applied on an interim basis. So, yep.
Yeah. Yep. I think we're committed to do that. All right. So operator, let's move to Bobby Olson. Bobby? Bobby, can I ask you to just make sure we know who you're representing?
Yeah, so Bobby Olson with SRP out in Phoenix, Arizona, and it may sound like a little bit of a broken record. I think Stuart did a good job of characterizing it, and I know Jeff was going there as well, but I do think we need to think about consequences kind of in two separate time horizons. There's the consequence associated with kind of passing RSE for EDAM, and then as you guys are clearly speaking to, what are the consequences of EDAM participants also participating in EIM? And I state that because a lot of the optimization that's going to occur here is going to result in decommitment of longer start units, and that will materially affect entities' ability to pass real-time tests under EIM. And so I think we just need to keep that in mind and have that discussion as we move forward about what the cure looks like and or obligations associated with EDAM intertwined with EIM. You guys are already speaking to that and just kind of leaning into the concept that we really do need to have that conversation as well.
Thanks, Bobby. I appreciate that. And your thoughts are well taken, and sounds like you've got plenty of good company with what we've heard from Jeff and Stuart and Alva as well. So we'll try to make sure we keep that front and center. Let me ask folks if you I still see a number of hands raised. If you'd like to still chat, then keep your hand raised, but otherwise if you'd lowered it, I'd appreciate it just so we can keep managing who's to speak next. So Alva, I know you've had your hand up for a little while. Let me see if you still wanted to share with this conversation.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. I think one of the things to consider is that this situation would apply, once the hurdle rate has been applied to transfers, it will apply for the RUC process as well as the IFM process, and it will apply for imbalance reserves as well as energy. So I think some of Jeff's concerns about loads evading the payment of that price could be avoided based on how the ISO solves its need for imbalance reserves, and then it's also in solving the RUC process. And that could also alleviate concerns about EIM. And I would note that I think Kathleen Colbert had actually proposed that those who passed the day-ahead EIM, the day-ahead EDAM RSE test would be exempt from the EIM RSE test, which I think is a little excessive, but you can see how once you have that sufficiency, it is unlikely that you are going to fail in real time, as long as those capacity needs are also being embedded in the cost that people are seeing.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the points Danny's going to make later on in one of the slides is to point out that we really do need to make sure that these products that are coming in the RSE are, otherwise highly reliable. And so that would certainly, sounds like, feed into the concept you're making, right, Alva? If it is highly reliable in the day ahead, then is it reasonable to assume it's going to still be there in real time?
Very good. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. And speaking of Kathleen, I see her in the queue. So let me make one comment as we unmute.
I'd say, is there any way I can follow up with Alva?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Danny.
Yes. Sorry, Kathleen. Sorry, Phil. Alva, I didn't explicitly address test RUC because I think we're still working through with this broader community what RUC looks like in an EDAM construct. I envision EDAM having a RUC because it's a really essential core component of the EDAM process, but the assumptions that you'd make regarding the transmission that gets released to RUC and the intra-BAA transfers to the RUC process is something that I think is still a little TBD, and we will need more discussion on. On your transitioning into EIM, one thought that occurred for me and a potential option would be to maybe structure it that not every entity automatically passes the EIM RSE, but if the group of entities who are part of the EDAM would still have sufficient bid range and flexibility to meet that larger footprint obligations going into the EIM, then maybe there would be the opportunity for those entities to essentially move into the EIM RSC together. And to the extent that that 97 or that 2.5% uncertainty didn't materialize in all of the different BAAs simultaneously, it would be likely that that larger footprint would not have issues passing the EIM RSC.
Yeah, that seems promising. It seems like the test should, the day-ahead test should be used to make the EIM RSC more efficient in any case. So.
Yeah, that's great. All right, so let's go to Kathleen. Kathleen, as we get your mic opened up, let me just make an observation. We've spent to now 20 minutes on Danny's first slide, and he's got a few more to go. So just want to make the observation that at some point we need to move on if we want to hear the rest of Danny's thoughts. So Kathleen, what do you got for us on this one?
Well, if you want me to be the last one before you move on, I'm good with that, Phil. So this is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I raised my hand to say a specific thing, but I did want to just note deepest respect to Alva. I'm also struggling super hard with remembering who says what in all of these meetings. I'm so there, guys. I'm so there. Thank you for all your summaries to the folks on the CAISO side for keeping me on top of things. But I just want to clarify that that is not my suggestion, that there be an EDAM RSC test only. And if at some point I somehow communicated that, I apologize for confusing the group. I think what Alva is saying is very consistent with what I would have said, is that what I believe we've been trying to communicate is there may be rationale.
So Kathleen, let me just be clear. So you didn't say it, but you still support it, and that's what you want to promote.
No, I have no idea what I may or may not have proposed. So I was just going to clarify. I think that an EDAM RSC test having financial consequences makes sense. I think that an EIM RSC test is absolutely necessary and would never have alluded to not performing an EIM RSC test. My understanding of what changes between EDAM to EIM is that the financial penalty should be sending a signal to go out and know that you need to cure that in advance of the real-time runs. And that for real-time, what fundamentally would change is that EDAM areas that are EIM areas not in EDAM would have a balancing test or equivalent because they would be using base schedules. The EIM areas that are in EDAM would be treated similarly to CAISO today, where it uses the day-ahead market results for that test. So I think it's pretty consistent with what Danny said and Alva. Not really sure where the wires got crossed. But just wanted to clarify there. But what I did want to raise something substantive, pro and con about this idea, because I think that's what you guys are really looking for. Something that hasn't been said is that the market can be incredibly sensitive to hurdle rates and the values that we put hurdle rates at. And in practice, if the hurdle rate might actually result in the same outcome of limiting the transfers, but then may result. And so I just think that it's an important thing for us to look at and kind of we'd have to run some simulations to see, but depending on the size of the hurdle rate, and the 2,000 would be pretty significant, it would just likely result in limiting the transfers anyway. And so I think that is a con for the idea of a hurdle rate. But keep thinking about it. Thanks.
All right. Danny, I'm going to say let's move on to your next slide.
I just have one follow-up, Kathleen. Is it the concept or just the question of where that hurdle rate would be set?
Yeah, just flagging.
That administrative hurdle rate.
I think you alluded to this, but I wanted to make it clear for folks that it could result if administrative value, that hurdle rate, is not something the market can respond to, then the price is not going, then it doesn't, the dispatch isn't going to change. If the market is willing to consume that, if the loads are willing to consume it, then it could. I just think it kind of, we've run some tests with hurdle rates and for different purposes, and it's just very sensitive to the level you set them at.
So this almost gets back to Alva's initial point of we would need some mechanism to be sure that this solution would be able to cure a day-ahead schedule or a day-ahead insufficiency even before proceeding down this path. Okay, thank you, I understand.
All right, so Danny, let's move on.
Okay, so the second idea that has kind of circulated to the ISO through kind of offline conversations with some stakeholders who reached out to us was the idea of having an IFM rerun. And I think the idea here would be that the entity that was resource insufficient in the day ahead, there wouldn't be any transfer limitations, and the EIM, with the underlying assumption that the EIM would be able to cure that insufficiency through an optimal dispatch, it would optimally dispatch and produce a day ahead schedule. The hook then is after the fact, at some point between when the day ahead market is run and when the real time is run, there could be a rerun with transfers limited or with a hurdle rate, or probably not a hurdle rate, but with transfers locked, and try to see what the redispatch to cure that deficient VA actually cost. That could be summed up, and that revenue could then be allocated out to the broader footprint that supported that curing the hours of insufficiency for that BAA. I'm not sure if this is a good solution or a bad solution. I don't know how big the price differences would be during type. They could be fairly small. They could be large. I would be looking for feedback if this is a viable idea that's worth pursuing from the stakeholder community.
Well, so Danny, this is Phil. Let me just make this sort of, I guess, clarifying questions, right? So some of the same things we just talked about in your first scenario is that, like Alva mentioned, does this still work if it's a larger area deficiency, right? And it sounds like, no, this still makes the presumption that there's enough resources in the full EDAM footprint, and we're just trying to deal with maybe one or two deficient BAs, but there's still sufficiency in the larger footprint. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I think that the thought is that we would, so I guess there would have to be an additional RSE test run on the footprint level to make sure that there's sufficient supply and flexibility to cure the entire, or to optimally dispatch the entire footprint as a whole, to not shift around that insufficiency to different BAAs.
Yeah. So a second thought comes to mind here. I didn't really see it in the first one, but it's become a little more clear here, and that is, again, maybe it's your first bullet that does it for me, that if we have, EDAM entities that were resource sufficient, and then they support this transfer, right, to the deficient EDAM BA, how do those EDAM entities reflect their, should we just say, their willingness or their additional bid range or additional capacity that could be used in this way, right? Because if they really come in with 100% RSC coverage, you're presuming they have 105 or 110 that could be used to cover a deficient one. How would we know that? How would the ISO know that there is additional out there available?
Well, I think that gets into some type of pretest to determine that the footprint could be dispatched as a whole. I think what now you're getting into is how would the revenue be allocated from the different.
I'm just still going down the path of the total capacity and the mechanism for an EDAM entity that might be willing to sell and provide the additional capacity to you. How would they communicate that to you?
Yeah, I think that would be implicitly, like, there would likely have to be some run using a variation of the tool that George is proposing that's able to run this optimization on a BAA level. Maybe it would take away those BAA boundaries and run it. And then once that occurred, I think just the fact that the additional supply was bid into the EDAM would make it available to help cure this type of insufficiency.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. All right. Well, we got some folks in the queue. So looks like Kathleen, you're up first. Operator?
Sure.
Kathleen, can you make sure you announce who you're with?
Of course. This is Kathleen Colbert with Vistra. So first on the total system shortfall point, it's something we talked about in a prior meeting, and maybe this is about what I'll kind of repeat my understanding of how that would shake down. I agree it's some kind of test that would occur. I frankly think that it would be identified before the day-ahead market run. And I think we are in a situation, if there is total system insufficiency where transfers cannot be used to bring the whole system into sufficiency, then we're in a really serious reliability situation. We're not in a running a financially binding market to try and come out with an outcome situation. We have noticed that we are going to have a reliability issue tomorrow. And so, as you know, when that occurs, alerts are issued from grid operations. The grid operators, the reliability coordinators are taking very different emergency-related actions in order to try and address that kind of issue. So while I think the point is really important, my understanding was that we were going to talk through these options from the lens of the total system is sufficient, and that we were scheduling later in the working group meetings a time to talk about this edge case of it's not sufficient. So just kind of reminding a little bit of that plan. I thought that plan made sense. So with that assumption, I am assuming the rest of what I say is you've done this assessment and we're total system-wide sufficient. And so with that in mind, I think this idea has a lot of merit. I've toyed in my head with, is it a rerun after IFM? Is it something that we want to perform before IFM as a maybe baseline run? I do think it's really dependent on if we can all get comfortable with financial consequences alone versus wanting to limit the transfers is a function of whether it needs to be a pre-run or a rerun. I kind of picking up from this slide that you're thinking maybe let's talk about if we are comfortable with financial consequences only, and then it would allow for it to be done after the market run so that we're less constrained with timing. I think that is an interest. I would ask the CAISO, if you don't mind, do you have a preference right now is for it being a rerun over something done prior to the IFM?
I'd like to reframe the question, Danny, is, while you titled this IFM, is it necessarily IFM, or does Kathleen make a good point? You're just talking about a market run that could be done. And as she suggested, right, pre or post IFM is a fair question. When, where, how we would do it, I guess, have you really thought through it enough to know whether that's something we could do or when we would do it? Or is that still an open question?
I think that's an open question, and we need to turn to our technology teams. I do envision that this would be a heavy lift from our technology team if we do proceed to go down this route. So I would defer to them about the feasible. I think for us to even consider this, there'd have to be really widespread support for this idea, but then we would look to probably George to weigh in about where this could even feasibly be done. I'm just putting this out there as an idea of potentially trying to figure out how we could financially apply consequences to deficient BAAs.
All right, good, thanks.
So that's really, really helpful.
Yeah, I think this is a point I was trying to make a little bit ago, is that obviously this is just trying to put some ideas out there, right, Danny, and get a sense of where folks are at, because then there's still going to have to be some more work done to flesh these out, right? Because my understanding is you and the rest of the ISO team have really not had a chance to flesh out these in any level of detail. Is that fair?
I think we've given it an initial, is this reasonable? thought, but the actual intricacies of working this out before we dedicate the time and resources to trying to figure out what it looks like, we wanted to get stakeholder feedback on where they would be with this idea.
Okay, good. All right. Okay, so with that in mind,
Phil, may I give my feedback? Okay, so this is Kathleen from Vistra. I think this has a ton of merit to consider. Implementation details aside, this using the IFM, and then in my mind, it's an IFM equivalent or rough, we can kind of talk about what's the right type of run to come up with what the equivalent base schedules would be without any kind of transfer being provided, which would test for resource sufficiency. It solves a lot of the challenges we've been discussing in these working group meetings for almost 2 months now about making assumptions about how resources are going to be dispatched and used throughout the day. It leverages the market without oversimplification, so we know what we're getting is realistic to what the market might do. And most importantly, we're also talking and exploring what kind of runs might need to be done to support the greenhouse gas discussions that we're having in that working group. And so as we're thinking about talking in a single working group about we're going to run an optimization, we're going to do to come up with baseline schedules, I think it's prudent to think about if decisions in one working group should be being considered in others as something that is an additional advantage to keep it on the table. So we're not, duplicating and overcomplicating our solutions by coming up with different approaches where we could leverage and streamline a single kind of run to support both of these purposes. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Operator, let's go to Stuart Kelly. Stuart, can you remind folks who you're with?
Stuart Kelly with Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. 3 observations, I guess. If an entity commits to, providing additional resource to cure a shortfall, I start to think about what happens, in the event there's still a real-time test to pass, and let's say that entity then becomes short in real time because of a changed load forecast or whatever. I'd like to understand what the expectation is there under this scenario. I think in terms of the second bullet, I don't think that the price difference may be enough or a disincentive to encourage folks to, procure enough ahead of the day-ahead test. So that may need to be modified to maybe the minimum of some administrative price or price difference in this particular approach. And I firmly believe that, and maybe I just need more education in this, there is a role for, and I've said it before, for limiting transfers. I think I would like the outcome of this to be the exception, not the norm, because if it becomes the norm, I have a firm belief, and it's maybe lack of knowledge, that folks will come to rely on this, and then we'll pay the price for that long term and won't be able to cure it particularly quickly.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. Looks like Jeff Nelson's up. Jeff?
I'm going to take my hand down before I forget. Jeff Nelson, SC. I'm just struggling with understanding the mechanics of this. So you have someone that has evidently failed the RSC, right? And they showed their bucket 1 transfers, they showed their internal bids, and they didn't have enough to pass the RSC, okay? So then we run the market and they quote unquote lean on the market. Maybe some other transmission into their area crosses a hurdle rate and they're able to bring some additional supply in and get all their needs. Okay, so I think that's the situation we're framing up in this example. Then we would do a rerun and say, hey, you're not allowed to quote unquote lean on the system. You can only, and here's I guess question 1A is it only that entity that's restricted to bucket 1 transfers, or are you only using bucket 1 transfers in the entire market?
I think that's an open question. It would likely be that the failed entity.
Right.
on
Okay.
the rerun.
Okay, that's what I thought. I just wanted to see if I was thinking this through. So the question goes to, if they didn't have enough to pass their RSC initially and they had to lean on the market to serve themselves, and then you do a rerun where they're not allowed to quote unquote lean on the market, how are they even going to solve? And won't market prices everywhere else go down because now they're not allowed to buy out of the pool?
I think the idea would be to try to isolate the costs that Eric raised initially about clearing the full market higher on the bid stack with the additional demand.
Okay, so you would expect, so you are looking at the prices going down in the second run, and then, okay.
You'd look at the delta, and then you'd figure out what the delta is, and that could be some form of a financial consequence that could be allocated out.
Okay, so you are expecting them to not clear the second run, and you are expecting prices to go down elsewhere. Okay, at least I kind of understand the mechanics.
Again, the market's very complicated. It could go both ways, but I would expect them to likely be lower in the second run without clearing all that additional demand, at which point there would be a price difference that could serve as some form of financial consequence.
Yeah, okay, I'll have to think more about it. My general, we already do a lot of runs, so I generally am adverse to throwing additional runs in, but this is sort of kind of, I don't know. Okay, well, I think I get it, kind of, maybe, sort of. So they're not allowed to lean at all in the second run?
I think that's an open question, the amount of leaning that could take place in the second run.
Yeah, because I'm just trying to think through. They're not going to clear, right? If they didn't have enough bids, to pass the RSA initially, and now they're not allowed to get anything from the market, they're not going to clear. And I just don't know what that does. I really don't know what that does to the market. I don't know. That's weird. That's weird. It's almost like they're removed from the market. But I'm not sure if they're going to spill over because their prices should probably go super, super high in their area, but they're not allowed to buy anything. It's kind of a weird situation. Okay. I don't understand it enough to comment, and that makes me nervous. Thank you.
Well, again, Jeff, we're still just throwing some things out here, it sounds like, and just having a conversation. So you're trying to get clarity, I think, is worthwhile for sure. I'm going to jump to Jeff Spires. Jeff, we haven't heard from you yet. What are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Phil. Good afternoon. Jeff Spires with PowerX. I think I had similarly to Jeff Nelson, I was a little bit confused, and I think that last conversation was at least somewhat helpful to understand this a little bit better. But I think my higher level feedback is that, if financial consequences are going to be effective for the resource sufficiency test, they have to provide the right incentive to encourage entities to be resource sufficient upfront. And so I think in my mind, just the concept here of attempting to calculate the incremental variable costs of resources that we're filling in the shortfall is not going to achieve that. I think for financial consequences to be successful, they need to reflect a high enough cost that entity is going to be incented to take the steps up front and not show up short and use the market to fill in that shortfall. And I don't think this achieves this. I also just wanted to add a couple of thoughts about the first approach, based on some of the comments that Kathleen was making. I think that the concept of having a hurdle rate in the market, if that price is set at the right level and set high enough, could be a better mechanism to provide that kind of incentive. But I also think that it's worth thinking through. There is another benefit of having a hurdle rate in the market, which is that you wouldn't end up necessarily in a situation in which the transfers are initiated without contemplating the fact that that entity has failed, and then later that entity is now faced with a penalty. If you have it a hurdle rate in the market itself, as Danny was mentioning before, that allows for that entity to use its own resources first, and in effect, the total transfer that ends up being delivered to that BA would be reduced, and they'd really only be getting any imports to the extent that they really needed them to fill in the gap. And so to the extent that an entity has a smaller failure or is not wanting to be facing that penalty, I think they're better off to the extent that the hurdle would avoid that outcome and would only, would only result in a transfer once you've got to the point where your internal resources have been deployed and now you're in need of filling in whatever quantity that is necessary. So I think there are some benefits there that are worth thinking through in that first proposal.
Okay, Jeff, thank you. Okay, we haven't heard from George yet. I'm going to turn to George Angelides from the ISO. George?
Thank you, Phil. This is George Angelides with the ISO. I was listening to this conversation here, and I can't help realizing that we're moving in a very difficult and complex direction, and there's no really need to. As Jeff said, really, we already have an alternative in our mind about how this is going to work. What happens is we have a situation where an EDAM BAA fails the RSC test, right? Let's say it fails it in the upward direction. Okay, what does this mean? This means that if we go and run the market now, it comes next, and we freeze the transfers for that BAA, the import transfer specifically here, so that they can't import any more energy than what is already allowed through bucket one. Of course, we have to allow that. Then that means they will probably fail in reaching a feasible solution. We'll probably have a situation where the power balance constraint for that BAA will be violated. And we're looking here at an alternative where we say, what can we salvage this situation and say, let's allow additional transfers in from other BAAs that are interconnected with this BAA and put a financial price on that on the count that what's the marginal price in that BAA if we have to relax the power balance constraint. That's the price ceiling. So therefore, you say, okay, that's the marginal price of additional energy to help serve your load in this tight situation. Let's assign this price to all import transfers. It will essentially look like bucket 3 now, all right? And then the market will try to find a feasible solution. That may not be even be required. I mean, maybe there is not enough transmission capacity to save the situation. You may still have to rely on the relaxation of the power balance constraint, but at least you're helping, right? You have less of a violation. And there were questions on whether there's going to be a feasible solution. We don't know that, but we're trying to salvage the situation of having a BAA going short into real time by having the ability to remedy the situation at some cost. The cost here in this example is the price ceiling, whatever that is. And then once you have that situation, at least from the market perspective, you essentially price energy on the margin administratively because that BAA cannot meet its own requirements since it failed the RSC. And of course, that doesn't end there. We'll have to do some additional changes to the settlement because those transfers may become congested. So there is transfer revenue, and we shouldn't split the transfer revenue 50-50 anymore between EDAM BAAs. we should not be returning half of the transfer revenue to the BAA that is supposed to pay the additional cost for this energy. We'll probably have to give it to all exporting BAAs at some pro rata fashion, realizing the fact that there is additional supply on these BAAs that is scheduled for the benefit of the BAA that failed the RSC test. So this is really a very simple solution. We don't really need another run. We already have 5 in the EDAM. I don't think there is any room for any more. It's already a tall task, and I don't see what benefit this additional run will provide. What kind of information we're looking from that? We already know everything that we need to know from when the RSC results are available, and we know that this BAA fails the test. We know exactly what to do, both on alternative 1 and on alternative 2. I don't see what needs to be, what drives the need for an additional run here. So let's save the complexity and try to do something simple and reasonable. Thank
you. All right. Well, thank you, George. That's a great segue because, again, folks, I'm just trying to look at Danny's got a few more thoughts for us to share, and so I think we ought to move on to the next slide. Let's take a look at some other thoughts he's got here, and then if we need to, and we have time at the end, we could certainly circle back to any of these topics. So I'm going to suggest we move on. Danny, what do you got next for us?
Well, I think that the next couple of slides would be options to try to cure failed RSC hour prior to the final binding run. This would be done based on the results of the advisory run. And the idea that the ISOs put out before back in 2019 and talked about a little bit in this process is the idea of like the bid range trading. So this would be trading imbalance reserve or energy requirements between BAAs with the underlying bucket 1 transmission to facilitate that transfer. George probably a month ago ran through an example of how this could work and how one BAA's requirements would be offset by the bid range transfer from another BAA. I think that what he noted in that presentation was that we would look to have this be able to be done dynamically. I think currently registering the ETSRs that would reflect these transfers is a master file process, so it's a little bit longer. We would look to update this and have it available to be on demand through cyber. The potential issue, I think, with this approach is just this is essentially moving bilateral transactions and having them reflected into the EDAM marketplace. If that's going to occur, great. We're asking, is this something that entities see occurring, or would a platform need to be provided to help facilitate this type of transaction through the morning when entities are running their advisory processes or advisory RSCs and potentially identifying shortfalls and then trying to cure those shortfalls? So that's the idea on this slide, Phil.
Okay, but so ideas they're reflected in the test, but I guess you're also asking that if we were to go down this path, the platform, who has this platform, where does it exist, right, and how is it hosted? Those are other things that you've got sort of embedded in here. Is that fair?
Yeah. I think there's an opportunity to the extent that entities would be interested in utilizing this type of functionality. A third-party vendor could build this type of platform. I think the ISO building it would, again, be a really heavy lift, so I'd want to defer to George. I think at a minimum, kind of a posting board that entities could make clear what their residual excess capacity is that could be used by other entities through this bid range trading or energy or IOU trading model could be a possibility, but we're just trying to gauge entity interest in this type of model as we think through how we might want to implement it.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Let's see. We've got Alva in the queue. Let's see what Alva has to say on this one. Alva?
Hello, this is Alva Svoboda from PG&E. I actually wanted to go back to the previous slide and argue that George's comments sort of demonstrated that, first of all, the IFM rerun is not necessary because you've done the initial RSE run if you've done it well enough, and that can actually be used as your counterfactual. And so in that way, and also that the deficiency that you're calculating is just gonna fall out of those two solutions. There's no need to do another full market run because it's going to simply be the difference between it's going to actually just be the insufficiency of the given BAA times a penalty price. Now, it is not necessarily the power balance because you also have the imbalance reserves being solved for in the EDAM. So you could have another penalty price setting that insufficiency, the cost of that, which you could ascribe to that transfer. But effectively, that becomes your hurdle rate. And so in that way, if you agree with George, as I do, that there's no need for this second solution, the first solution actually has the same effect as this one, if the hurdle rate is set properly. So, and I think the implication of the second approach is that the rerun would somehow lead to changes in the final prices that are going to be published and used as day-ahead market results, which I think implies that there may be a lot of moving parts that you're not going to have control over that may affect other market participants beyond just those within the deficient BAA. So in general, I think the second option is in my mind, I'd have to disagree with Kathleen. I don't think this is the stronger of the two options. Thank you.
So Albert, while I have you on the line, I wanted to kind of follow up on a couple of things. I worry hearing your description that we might have oversold the RSE, or there might be a misconception of what the RSE optimization is. I think that we would look to have all unit constraints respected within that optimization, but it would not have transmission constraints. And I think its objective function would probably be to minimize, it would be either to minimize the number of intervals in which an entity failed the RSE, or to minimize the total megawatt deficiency across the 24 intervals that it failed the RSE. So I don't know if it's going to give prices that could be used as a counterfactual, or I don't envision it giving prices that are going to be used as a counterfactual to replace this type of idea.
Right. Remember, the only prices we're concerned with are the prices at the ties in this model. I think you potentially could have an RSE model, and it depends on how complex it is, certainly, but that would give you a good estimate of what the you're calculating a shortfall. You're going to live or die by that shortfall in the RSE, the final RSE evaluation. That should be what the participant effectively is going to expect to pay for. You might be right that there may be some differences because it may end up that the market solution solves differently, but it should be that the overall shortfall within a given BAA would then be reflected in the final solution, showing transfers into that BAA that corresponded to that shortfall. Now, if that isn't the case, then your RSE test is not a good one as far as quantity is concerned, and you need to improve it, in my opinion.
Okay, so if I follow you, you're almost highlighting a third option in which the RSE test, to the extent the objective function was to minimize the total megawatts of insufficiency across the day for a BAA, that total quantity of megawatts then potentially could have some type of administrative penalty applied to it.
Right.
When we actually would run the market. So we would just, like, to the extent we can clear the full market and there's sufficient supply and transmission, then we would have a market solution, but we would also have a side set of additional megawatts that were supplied through day-ahead energy assistance, which we could administratively apply a penalty with and then allocate out to different entities who were part of the footprint.
Yeah, I didn't even realize I was saying that, but that actually does sound like a possible approach. Just something to put on the list. Yeah, because you would, and it would be self-validating because if the solution is not consistent, for example, if you're able to solve the market and the resource sufficiency is not, I'm gonna have to, I might be just sort of riffing off of what you're saying. So I'm not so confident now that I think about it a little bit more that it's going to necessarily. I mean, you could have more transfers into the BA than the resource sufficiency alone had indicated, right? So, but on the other hand, you could say that as you're sort of suggesting, well, you're going to pay the market price in general, but for that portion which you were deemed to be insufficient for, you are going to be liable for a penalty price, and that might, sort of square the circle between the two.
Yeah, I think the delta in transfers could just be assumed to be economic displacement.
That's right.
Within that BA, but you'd at least have the quantity of deficiency.
Right.
Okay, this is. I think this is the exact type of feedback we were looking for as part of this working group, because this is an idea that I think the ISO will give some additional thought to.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
All right. Good, thanks. Glad Danny's got it. Okay, I guess we'll go to Kathleen, but Kathleen, are we talking about this or the next one? If you want to talk about this slide, I'd really like to try to keep it brief so we can keep moving.
Can I go to the next slide, please? Sure. So this is actually, I'm just going to make a really quick comment. To be clear, Vistra's not putting forward any kind of proposal. This is a CAISO slide deck. I'm asking clarifying questions while I'm asking questions. Alva, I actually think you and I are very, very in sync, and it's been Alva's points that Alva has raised through these meetings about the type of optimization that they would like to see and what we need to do. That's kind of is why I think that there might be some merit in exploring what the CAISO has put forward today. I think George also clarified something about the size of any kind of penalty that would come out, and so thanks to George for doing that. I don't think it would be insignificant if you set them at penalty prices. The other thing that I would just note is that I think what I heard Danny clarify on these options is that there's a lot of open questions and there's potential options for us to consider, and that this working group would iterate and kind of talk through pros and cons of those. And so with that in mind, I wasn't taking the proposal or the idea that we've been talking through as definitively being after the market or before the market, but as being a put forward based on stakeholder concerns that have been raised in these meetings that an oversimplified optimization might not be effective. And I think it's worth continuing to talk about that because, I have heard Alva raise that concern multiple times. And I think that another important clarification, and part of what I was raising when I mentioned is this, are we sold on it being after the market or could it be before the market? Is it really depends on how it's being used. So what Danny and Alva just talked around is really consistent with where if we had thought that CAISO would put something forward, it would be a resource efficiency evaluation run with blocking the transfers to identify the shortfall and then to apply a penalty onto that shortfall amount and out of the market charge. I'm not clear on what the CAISO's actual idea, the details of it, and that in the last slide. And I think a lot more detail is needed to kind of talk through that, and did hear some traction that it's worth considering this idea. Maybe that's his third option. How does the CAISO recommend we go about doing that as a stakeholder community?
Sorry, Kathleen, I'm not quite sure what you're asking. You're saying how to resolve that there are multiple options on the table. I think Danny was pretty clear about that. We want to get some feedback here, and to the extent something starts to rise, then what I thought I heard him say was then the ISO team could go back and do the additional detail to sort of flesh these things out. So some of the concerns being asked are good ones. But I guess I'm not quite clear what your ask is here.
Yeah, maybe it's clear to Danny. Danny, does this ask make sense to you? How do we go about looking through some of the deeper details of what a fuller optimization option would look like for the resource sufficiency test?
I think that the stakeholder process and the straw proposal itself would likely be where we kind of iterate through the proposal. So to the extent that there may be other entities who would kind of support one of these ideas, who want to do a little bit of the legwork and try to fill in some of the more detailed gaps of how it could be implemented, I think that would be a beneficial starting point to talk about and then iterate through the stakeholder process, the feasibility of those ideas from a policy and a implementation perspective.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we haven't heard from Carrie Bentley. Carrie, what thoughts do you have on this one?
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. Yeah, sorry that off mute took a bit. I have to admit I need to think about this more, and I'm not entirely clear. Perhaps this is what Kathleen was saying. Even what the CAISO's proposing here, it seems like a deviation from things we've discussed before. So I would really like to not actually give you WPTF's opinion right now, and perhaps you could flesh out in a couple slides more details, and then we could actually submit some sort of comments in writing. It's really hard for 107 people to respond on the fly, and because this is a significant piece of the EDAM design, I think it would be beneficial to nail this down prior to going toward the official initiative. So I would like to request that we coalesce around this in a more formalized way rather than just everyone raising their hands.
Well, again, these are just ideas based on, basically what I heard in the discussion we had last week. This is a significant shift from where at least the ISO thought folks were at, or what the ISO put on the table, which was those physical constraints on the transfers. So this was an effort to try to keep that dialogue going since we ran out of time last week. We can certainly bring this up again. I know Mark is intending to try to hold out one or two of our meetings near the end of this work group session to try to circle back to topics. And so, Carrie, maybe that's the way to think about this, and we can certainly suggest that that's what we do here, is circle back on this one after everybody's had a chance to think about it. Sounds like, including the ISO, based on the comments that have been received today, it sounds like the ISO team needs to go back and sort of flesh out some of this. And again, it sounds like I thought I heard that that's what Danny intended to do. Let's also not forget the point that Danny made, and I share this with everybody, for all of us to just remember that the work group process, we're trying to do just what we're doing here, and that is to just bring in thoughts and ideas. We may not actually come to a specific solution, but at least then it gives the ISO team enough to try to put it together into the comprehensive plan, which is the straw proposal, and we'll spend the rest of the year talking about design issues through that process. So just wanted to put stuff back in context to realize this is not the last opportunity to talk about how to cure deficiencies in the RSE.
Yeah,
okay.
Thanks for that, Phil. Yeah, I'll just say that I want to reiterate what Bonnie Blair said on the holistic call we had last week, where she said she really was unable to give in real-time feedback. And I think we should listen to that. A lot of my clients have said the same thing. And I think the problem with kind of having this more nebulous, let's all talk about it format is that the CAISO could be going down a road that really isn't workable for certain segments of our industry. And I think it would be beneficial to figure that out now rather than at the straw proposal phase. For example, on this, it sounds like to me we have three options. We have the physical option, we have a financial in-market option, and we have a financial out-of-market option. It'd be great if we just had a slide on that, and then you encourage people to provide, written comments, or even a note through your systems that I forget what it's called, but where you could click the button and email you guys directly, so you guys can get additional feedback up front, and maybe then we could talk a little bit further about some of the issues you receive. And I know that's a little bit harder and more of a lift for the CAISO, but I think it would reap greater rewards going into the initiative process. Thanks for considering.
All right. Thanks, Carrie. Tong, we haven't heard from you in a while. So, operator, let's open up Tong's line.
Hey, Phil.
Hi.
I like this bid. Tang Wu from WAPA. I like this bid range trading proposal. I don't know whether it's just the bid range trading, basically as a platform for people to meet their resource efficiency needs. People can go out and sign bilateral contracts, but that has a lot of overhead, especially if it's not for a large block of purchases. So I think this would be convenient. Of course, that means the ISO has to come up with a platform, basically a auction or some sort. I don't know. There might be some algorithms the ISO has to come up with. I don't know how difficult that would be. Okay, that's one comment. I also have some thoughts on the uncertainties and the consequences of insufficiency. So I think there are two groups of uncertainties. One group has real uncertainties that has to do with load forecasting error, renewable forecasting error, or things that has to do with the forecast. Really, you don't know your forecast. There are some uncertainties, and those uncertainties occur after the IFM, not before the IFM. And I think this kind of uncertainties probably would be captured by a capacity product. I don't know what the name you use. Maybe that's a part of a rock, or maybe some kind of imbalance reserve, or whatever you call it. There is also another group of uncertainties. These are not real uncertainties. These are just lack of knowledge on the participant side. When they try to meet resource efficiency, they only see their BA situation. They can make sure they have enough resources to meet their load, and they probably would consider ramping effect as well. And they need to have transmission for bucket one to bring in import, but they can only see their own feasibility. They don't see overall from ISO's point of view whether their arrangement would cause infeasibility to the ISO. I hope not. So if every bubble meet their resource efficiency needs is feasible, and then overall, most likely it will be feasible. It may not be optimal. It may be feasible. It may not be feasible. If it's not feasible, simultaneous feasible in terms of a ramp and transmission, and then you need some capacity. So maybe people would bid a little bit more than what their load is to accommodate the redispatch in IFM. This is another bucket of uncertainty. I think if you just focus on this bucket of uncertainty, basically lack of knowledge on the participants' part, to determine whether you fail or not, then it would reduces the chance of failing sufficiency just for IFM. You can consider the rest in rock and with a financial consequence, so that you do not artificially cause IFM to fail and resulting in high prices while there's still time to fix those problems. So between IFM and real time, there are many, many hours that people can fix problems. Even you have a solution in rock, still, every BA, the situation may change. They may have different resources, different problems. So things will change. So there's no need to put all those uncertainties in the IFM run and causing IFM to fail prematurely. So that's my kind of observation or some thoughts. I don't have organized thoughts to come up with a constructive suggestion how to deal with this, how to separate the uncertainties, how to forecast these two different buckets of uncertainties. It might be difficult, but just some thoughts at a conceptual level.
Okay. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Phil.
Appreciate that. Yeah, I see some folks who haven't chimed in yet today. Dan Williams, let's open up his line, and then I think I'll turn to Todd Bryan after Dan. So, Dan, what's on your mind?
Hey, Phil, thanks. Well, first of all, just listening to Tong from WAPA's comments there, I definitely support kind of digging in deeper into what he was talking about, and hopefully the discussions coming up on, I guess, Friday and next week around RUC and what's envisioned there will help with that, plus the DAME workshop that's coming up next Wednesday, because we still need to understand more about kind of how those products are going to solve things in IFM and RUC as well. But my reason for raising my hand was just to echo what Carrie said about finding some opportunities for more offline engagement. And I think that we saw in Working Group 3, how effective it can be to kind of come up with a set of questions and put those out there to the stakeholder community as homework questions. I think what the answers that we got back in Work Group 3 really helped clarify the need to go deeper on some of the proposals that are shaping up and just to clear up some fundamental misunderstanding. So I would really encourage that, figuring out some way to do that with what we're grappling with here in this work group. And alongside that too, I think in Work Group 3, there was a lot of work early on to establish a set of principles that then any of the proposals would be measured back against. And this group is dealing with fundamental market design issues, and we really do need a set of principles that keep us from going down roads with solutions that lead to overall inefficient markets. And some of my concerns around just transparency and price formation, having misaligned incentives, or not considering market participant roles or how different participants fit into the market, storage and other resources. If we aren't tying back to that, we could end up with spending a lot of time in a straw proposal on something that is just at odds with efficient market design. So those are just a few thoughts and maybe some potential ways to help move forward.
Okay, Dan. Let's turn to Todd. Todd Ryan?
You hear me?
There we go. Now we can hear you, Todd. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you. One quick point that I'd like to point out is I think a lot of the discussion today presumes that a BAA is failing because it didn't procure enough ahead of time. And I think we all know that, a wildfire could take out a major intertie, or some other 1 in a million thing can cause failures despite how much forward procurement goes on. And so, again, I would like to push people to think about how advanced showings or ex post analysis could be integrated to kind of to address the nuances of leaning to a greater extent.
Okay, are you still there, Todd?
Yeah, is that clear? Like, for example, to drive my point home, if someone were to, if we had some kind of advanced showing and a BAA had all their units lined up and they were sufficient and looking good going in, and then a major wildfire did take out an intertie, that might be a different situation and deserve a different set of consequences than someone that is consistently showing up with just barely the minimum and finds themselves in a standard outage situation coming in short.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I'm hearing you, but I'm trying to understand how that fits in our context here. Is this an argument to go back to the topic that we set aside, at least for a little bit, which was the 45-day ahead showing, and try to do something more with that? Is that where you think you're going, Todd?
I'm suggesting that a penalty price or some kind of financial penalty or cutting off transfers may not be appropriate in all situations, and that something like an advanced showing or an ex post analysis could be useful in parsing between situations that deserve the type of financial incentives to do forward procurement and those that financial incentives wouldn't affect.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think we understand where you're going. I'll leave it to the ISO team to see what to do with that concept. I'm looking at the list. I see Christine, your hand is up, and we haven't heard from you yet today. So let me try to turn to Christine Monahan. Who are you with, Christine?
Hi, this is Christy with SRP. Can you hear me?
Yeah, gotcha.
Hi, I just had a question. It's a clarifying question on how our current MRTU fits into this. Coming from an EIM participant who also participates in the MRTU process, does that fit into the RSE somehow, or is that potentially part of the curing after RSE? Or maybe this is totally unrelated.
I'm not sure I'm understanding your question. Can you try to rephrase it, Christine? Give it to us again.
Right. So I guess intertie bidding, for example, in the current MRTU runs, is that part of, or could be part of the curing process? Is that type of bidding?
Danny, you have some thoughts on that, or is that something we need to take back and think about?
No, I think this is the bigger question of what does the current intertie bidding framework that the CAISO has in its day ahead process look like for the CAISO and potential EDAM member BAAs. My understanding is that that is teed up actually for discussion in a transmission, the Transmission Working Group 2, I think tomorrow or early next week. So I would like to defer any conversation of that as a curing strategy for the RSE till we've had the opportunity for that conversation to take place in Working Group 2.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. That helped me get a better sense of it. I can support that. I think it's next week that it's going to come up, but Christine, it is definitely something that we realize we need to have some discussion and provide some more clarity on, and that's going to be in Work Group 2. So at least I can confirm what Danny was saying there. Okay, let's see. I still have Tong and Stuart in the queue. Tong, I'm going to skip you for now. Let's go to Stuart. Tong, if you still want to respond to this, you can. You lowered your hand. Okay, good. So, Stuart, did you still want to say something, or was your hand up?
Yeah, Phil, thank you. Yeah, and I think to give feedback on this particular proposal, I think we have to have the intertie bidding discussion next week before we'll be in a position to provide feedback, because I'm not clear on the definition of third party, because if this is third party within the EDAM BAA, I would expect that third party to be bidding regardless, and I would have some concerns that, in stress system conditions, if we make this available, there's a potential to hold back supply and, maybe benefit from higher administrative prices. But if it's meant to, third party's definition is out with the EDAM BAA, I think usefully need to understand how the intertie bidding, what that looks like, what transmission is needed to do that, and where the boundaries are before I can, usefully comment on this particular proposal.
Okay, fair enough. So let me take this opportunity. I had a chance to check in with Milos, and the intertie bidding is actually going to be tomorrow, so it is this week. It's on the Work Group 2, and that group is going to be at 9 a.m. tomorrow. So 9 a.m. to 11 tomorrow in Work Group 2 on the intertie bidding. And it sounds like that's what we can do with this sort of interdependency between what we're doing here in RSC and what they need. They know they need to discuss in the transmission group. Okay.
Perfect.
Let's move on to the next slide. Danny, we'll see if we can try to bring it home here. I know you just had a few more thoughts, and folks, if we don't get through this now, then we can, we'll have to pick it up next week, because Danny, as I recall, you are out of town on Friday. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I think
Okay.
the follow-up would be next Monday. This was,
okay.
I think Alva at the very end of the previous meeting brought up the concept of some entity, maybe the CAISO as a market operator or each BAA having kind of day-ahead procurement authority to cure resource insufficiencies. I just wanted to get stakeholder feedback on what this would look like and if this is a viable path. I think of kind of procurement done through the RA process and the CPM process as being kind of complicated, and I don't know if there's a way to simplify it for the EDAM. I don't really know how this would work under EDAM BAA's oaths, so I just wanted to get more or have a follow-up on the conversation that we weren't able to have during our last meeting to understand more what stakeholders mean by this option so we can give it some thought.
I don't know if you're trying to say something.
I think you went on mute.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I was on mute, but I was looking to see if anybody on the call wanted to try to respond to where you're at, Danny. When I see this slide, I mean, let me ask you this. Why wouldn't any EDAM BAA be able to make any of their own day-ahead procurement decisions, right? They could go out and buy on their own. So I wasn't quite clear as what's the offering here? What would this be? This would be the ISO actually doing the procurement on their behalf?
I think that might have been the idea that Alva was suggesting, but I did see him in the call or two, so I'd like to give him the opportunity to try to fill in some of the edges of this idea.
Okay, so we'll go to Alva in just a second, but I guess I'm trying to just clarify what you're teeing up here. Were you actually trying to explore if there were ideas beyond what Alva was saying? Is that why it's kind of open-ended here, at least the way you've got it presented on the slide?
Yeah, I think we want to be open-ended and see what stakeholders think about some type of procurement. The ISO as a market operator may have more information about the excess residual supply in different BAAs, so may be able to help facilitate that. Obviously, that's a very large leap from how day-ahead procurement is done today. So I just wanted a little bit more information about how this could work from someone like Alva who may have given it a little bit more thought.
Okay. Well then, operator, let's turn to Alva. And Alva, maybe you have a chance to think about it some more. If not, that's fine. But let's see what your thoughts are on this one and try to give us a little bit more info.
This is Alva again from PG&E. My thought right now is that my idea at the end of the call was a little half-baked, and it was because it was trying to combine. So I think the thing is there's, in this concept of resource efficiency, there's the issue of being able to participate as a viable participant in an economic market, and having an ISO or even a BAA procure capacity to make that possible is essentially combining what actually does happen in what we call the RUC process, or some version of that, with the IFM process. And so I think the way you've described it makes it clear to me, Danny, that that's not a good idea for facilitating an economic and efficient market, but it is a question that comes up in terms of how capacity insufficiency, as evaluated by the market, not resource adequacy, but just in the market insufficiency, whether it's for a BAA or for the market as a whole, how that gets dealt with. I believe that the CAISO already has the authority to deal with those kinds of infeasibilities by having, as you described, knowledge of what's out there and then doing exceptional dispatch. So I'm much less confident now that the idea of some sort of formal backstop procurement process would be necessary, especially with given some of the concepts you brought up in this meeting.
Okay, Alva, that's helpful.
All right. Danny, in the interest of time, I'm going to say let's turn to the next slide, and let me ask you to just sort of tee this up for folks. Give everybody an opportunity to think about it, because as you and I were saying here a minute ago, you're not going to be with us on Friday. So Friday is going to be exclusively dedicated to RUC and convergence bidding, but we can come back to our normal session in RSE and sort of wrap up. What I want to do is just tee up this topic so folks can think about it and maybe be prepared to engage in a little more depth next Monday when we can come back to that, okay? Can I ask you to take a minute or two on that and just let them know where you're going, and then we'll move on so we can close out our session for today.
Yeah, sure, Phil. So one of the concerns that I heard at the end of the last meeting revolved around the reliability of some of the import schedules that different entities may be showing as part of their RSE to show that they're resource efficient. And there was a little bit of discussion about these would be highly reliable, but then there was concern on the other side of how does your partner know? I think one idea that was put forward was a day-ahead e-tag. I'm still struck, since that occurs, I guess, after the day-ahead market is run, I'm not really understanding how that may be able to add assurance of the reliability of transfers. So I kind of thought about this and started thinking, to provide assurance, there likely needs to be an incentive for entities to only represent import supply that they actually believe is very reliable. Right now, the CAISO has a task reversal policy, basically that day-ahead transfers or imports need to have it tagged by HASP. I would ask, is this sufficient in an EDAM construct to just require tagging by HASP and then exposure to the price differential in the real-time market, or would additional penalties be necessary to incentivize tagging? One of the themes that we've heard is there should be some type of penalty that grows in magnitude for repeat offenders who would routinely come into the EDAM resource insufficient. So I think the sub-bullets that you see there are just one idea of how something like this could be implemented. I do think that this could be discriminatory towards import supply, because I don't think it would be proposed, at least initially, to be applied to just conventional supply that would be shown as part of the RSC, so maybe it would need to, but the idea would be kind of a penalty option where for day-ahead import supply that doesn't show up, the higher of the FMM and RTD price at that injection point would then be exposed to kind of a two-tiered system, which would look at the non-delivery over a more recent period of time, as well as the non-delivery over a longer period of time, to just try to create some type of financial incentive to ensure that the import schedules that are getting shown are reliable. So again, this is just food for thought. I would be open to other ideas of how some type of financial incentive could be created around this import supply.
Okay, thanks, Danny. So again, opportunity for folks to think about this, try to consider a mechanism that could run basically afterwards, right? So, all right. Let's go to the next slide then, so we can sort of close things out for today. Our goal today was to talk about these failure consequences. What were the financial or economic type of approaches that we could take? Obviously, we didn't get through. Good discussion. I want to thank everybody for really engaging on this thing, and recognize it sounds like there's more for the ISO to think about this. So, Danny, I know you got some good input from folks, and you'll take that back. As I said, we can talk about all these topics, but certainly that last slide that Danny had, we'll bring that up on Monday when Mark Richardson's back. But for Friday, I wanted to just remind everybody again, Friday morning, 9 to 11, we'll have a session, and that's where we'll talk about the RUC and virtual or convergence bidding as well. And so with that, I want to turn to Bob Cott, and maybe just ask you to give us a quick sort of summary, what you were hearing, what you see going into the report for our session today. And after you're done, Bob, we'll close things out. So, Bob?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'll just kind of run through the different topics that Danny covered and try to give you a flavor of some of the comments that I heard on each of those. We started out with the financial consequences hurdle rate topic, and there was a lot of discussion there in presentation by Danny. There seemed to be some comments about the need to check feasibility of the solution for that, and then discussion around applicability for the EIM, and I think comments that the EIM test would still be needed, and also comments about the market being sensitive to hurdle rates. Then we moved into the IFM rerun topic, option for financial consequences, where there would be reruns only for bucket one transfers, and then charge a deficient BAA for redispatch cost, ensure supporting entities are compensated, and then a price difference to provide enough incentive for entities to be sufficient. And some comment about financial consequences need to be successful, must provide an incentive to ensure resource sufficiency. Then we talked about the options to cure day-ahead insufficiency. We got some suggestions about maybe a more robust feedback process. Penalty prices could vary based on the cause of insufficiency, and then the discussion about the intertype bidding that will be discussed tomorrow in work group 2. And then we covered the options for day-ahead procurement, and that basically is covering ability for day-ahead procurement decisions. Would they be BA specific? What's the rate for compensation? And how would this work under EDAM, BAs, OATTs? And I think there were some comments that this might not be necessary based on the discussion today. And then lastly, covered a potential topic we may talk about Friday about additional mechanisms. I think that covers everything we discussed today. Back to you, Phil.
All right, great. Thank you, Bob. Well, so I will say thank you, everybody, for engaging with us here this afternoon, and look forward to our session on Friday morning. And with that, I will wrap this up and say have a great afternoon, good evening.